For a long time now, research into interactive digital narrative has rested on one basic assumption that agency is something that we can see and track. The idea is that participation always traces back to a single decision point, a moment where someone chooses. So we get branching structures, dialogue trees, procedural story paths. All of these are designed around one picture of the participant as a cognitive agent picking options that were already laid out for them. I want to push in on that assumption a little. Drawing on practice based research in choreography, digital art, and immersive media, I want to suggest something different. That narrative meaning in interactive system doesn't have to come from choice at all. It can come from movement, from sensation, from spatial interaction, from how an environment responds to us. It can come from the body's presence within a responsive field, not from selecting option A over option B. So I'm developing a concept I'm calling choreographic systems. And I mean this both as a critical framework and as an actual design paradigm, where it offers a different model of interactive narrative, one where stories aren't selected, they're performed, where the participant isn't just picking from a menu, they're co-authors, and their bodily engagement within a responsive computational environment is what generates narrative coherence. That coherence isn't pre-built. It emerges out of the interaction itself. This sits at the intersection of performance studies, human-computer interface, and computational creativity. And what I'm ultimately after is a richer way of thinking about agency, authorship, and narrative design. One that's actually adequate to the full range of what interactive digital narrative can be at its most expansive. So what does this actually look like in practice? Choreographic systems propose a different ontology. Narrative isn't stored somewhere waiting to be selected. It's produced in the encounter itself between the body, environment, and the responsive computational system. And here I want to build on something Merce Cunningham did decades ago. He decoupled movement from narrative intention. He showed us that spatial and temporal organization alone can generate coherence without anything like a story in the conventional sense. That gives us philosophical grounding for a bigger claim. When a participant moves through a responsive system, they're not supplementing their thinking with some physical action on the side. It's one of the unified kinetic acts. That act itself is meaning making. If we want to keep using the word narrative here, then narrative is really just a trace left behind by that encounter. Let me give you a concrete example. Siobhan Davies' table of contents is a great example of this. Visitors walk through the space handling physical materials, and their proximity and gestures trigger digital content. This piece flat out refuses linear narrative. Instead, you get association, juxtaposition, physical encounter. No sequence, no casualty in the traditional sense. What you're left with is a narrative experience that's grounded entirely on how the participant's body engages with space and material. So where does coherence actually come from in a system like this? I'd argue it comes from three things converging. First, the participant's own lived experience, their movement, their environment, what they're feeling. Second, the system responding to them in ways that shape the experience without fully controlling it. And third, the space itself changing based on how people move through it over time. And because duration becomes a form of agency here, these choreographic systems really push us to rethink how we design, experience, and even evaluate interactive narratives. Now contrast that with mainstream human-computer interaction. Historically, it's been organized around a very particular model of the human, a cognitive agent who possesses information, forms intentions, and executes actions through discrete inputs, clicks, taps, buttons. Interfaces get built for a subject who's basically a decision-making, a task completer. And that's a partial picture at best. It gives us interfaces optimized for cognition, while badly under-theorizing what the body is actually doing during interaction. And in interactive narrative specifically, this matters a lot because systems built on this framework tend to locate narrative agency entirely in the decision. The body gets reduced to just an instrument for executing choices rather than being recognized as the medium through which the narrative experience actually happens. Camille Utterbach's Precarious gives us a really precise counterexample. Participants discover that just being present, just moving through the installation, continuously destabilizes and reshapes a delicate, balanced visual environment. There's no decision point where coherence gets achieved. Instead, it's perpetually negotiated through sustained physical attention, through spatial commitment. This piece makes visible exactly what cognitive human-computer interface designers render invisible, that the body's duration, its weight, its relational attunement to a responsive environment. These aren't supplementary to narrative agency, they are the primary medium. Christian Knoll's biomapping takes us even further out into an urban space. He equips participants with a galvanic skin response sensors during their city walks, and then generates maps where physiological arousal gets overlaid onto geographic terrain. What you get are these affective autobiographies. The body's involuntary responses to the environment become the actual authoring force of the narrative. What biomapping shows us is that the body carries and continuously generates narrative knowledge that never passes through conscious decision at all. A story of someone's embodied relationship to a place is written in cessation first, and computational systems designed to read and spatialize that sensation can make those stories visible without ever reducing them down to a choice. So taken together, what do all of these frameworks propose? A reorientation both of how we evaluate this work and in how we design it. We replace structural coherence with relational coherence as our primary measure of success. We start foregrounding effective trajectory movement through durational commitment as a fundamental unit of agency. And the question shifts from, does this system tell a coherent story, to does this encounter between a participant and a system generate a coherent experiential arc? One that's unique to that body, that session, that's unrepeatable interaction. Design, in other words, shifts from controlling narrative outcomes to shaping conditions for encounter. Thinking back to Precarious, the participant's movement continues reshapes the visual environments. The narrative emerges through that embodied interaction rather than through a predetermined path. Now, where does AI fit into all of this? I'd say the most immediate contribution AI makes to embodied narrative is genuine adaptation. We're talking about systems that don't just respond to movement according to fixed rules, but actually learn a participant's movement patterns, their preferences, their rhythms over time, and modulate their responses accordingly. That turns the interaction from a fixed score into a living one. The system becomes a responsive interlocutor, one that develops an actual relationship with a specific participant, and a narrative emerges through the accumulation of that relationship over time. AI systems trained on physiological, gestural, and facial data are increasingly good at detecting emotional states. Generative models can produce environmental responses of extraordinary richness and variety, so the responsive field never exhausts itself through repetition. And systems with a persistent memory can generate narrative development at a time scale that a single session of interactive system just can't reach. Take Rafik Anudal's Unsupervised. It trains a Style GAN 2 model on works from MoMA's collection and continuously transverses the latent space between them, while also pulling in real-time environmental input, visitors' movement, ambient sound, light, weather, to shape its output. What's interesting is that the interaction model here is environmental and aggregate, not individual and intentional. No single visitor is controlling it, but no visitor is passive within it either. The narrative that emerges has temporal shape, effective coherence, and a developmental arc, all without any authored sequence or branching structure. It shows us how an AI can operate as a responsive possibility structure rather than a predetermined storyteller, generating real depth through the continuous convergence of participants' embodied presence. This can move us away from stories we process towards stories that we actually feel. And then there's Lynn Hirschman Lison's Dina, an AI driven agent whose identity, emotional states, and conversational behavior evolve through accumulated interactions over time. This shapes a narrative of a relationship, one where participants' returning presence, their shifting emotional register, their durational commitment actually shape who Dina becomes. So here's the contrast. Unsupervised treats AI as an environmental system generating many possible outcomes, and Dina treats it as a relational presence that develops alongside one specific participant. One explores an aesthetic field, the other builds on ongoing encounters. But both of us show the same underlying thing, that AI can act as a genuine collaborator in shaping embodied narrative experience, not just as an autonomous storyteller. When you generate an AI system that actually can learn from the participant and the work adapts, it generally changes because of the encounter. And that in turn, the AI is into a kind of a co-protagonist in the story that belongs to both of them. This reframes authorship entirely. Narrative gets produced within an evolving relationship between the participant and the system, and meaning emerges through their ongoing mutual transformation. So, pulling all of this together, what I want to suggest is this: that interactive digital narrative has been working with an unnecessary, diminished model of both the human and the computational system. And every framework I've walked through today shares one basic claim, that narrative emerges from what happens between a body and a responsive system in real time.